The first thing I should tell you about Elias Cutter is that he talked to his horse more than he talked to people. Not in the way lonely men sometimes do, not desperate, not unhinged. He just seemed to find the horse more reliable, more honest. He'd come in from a ride and I'd hear him through the hayloft boards, low and even, telling that roan mare named Tuesday exactly what kind of day it had been, and the mare would snort or shift her weight, and Elias would say, "Yeah, I thought so too," and that would be the end of it. He was 41 years old. He'd been on that land, 320 acres of high mesa scrub north of the San Carlos boundary, since 1873. 14 years. Long enough that the cabin had the particular smell of a place that had never once been occupied by a woman. Pine resin and boot leather, and something underneath it all that I can only describe as held in. Like the walls themselves were keeping something back. I'd come to him in October. My father had called me useless one too many times, and I believed him by then, so I just left. Walked 6 miles in the wrong boots and knocked on Elias Cutter's door because my uncle had worked for him once, briefly, and he'd said Elias was fair. That was the whole recommendation. Fair. But in the territory in 1887, fair was worth more than most things you could name. Elias had looked at me for a long time, long enough that I thought he was going to turn me away. And then he said, "You eat a lot." I said I didn't. He said, "The hayloft's dry. There's a blanket up there from when my dog used to sleep in it. It smells like dog." I told him that was fine. He said, "I know it is. I'm just warning you so you don't come down here in the middle of the night telling me something smells like dog." That was the longest conversation we had in 6 weeks. The blizzard started on a Thursday. I remember because Elias always did his accounts on Thursday evenings, sitting at the table by the window with a stub of pencil and a ledger that had water damage along the bottom third of every page. He'd work for an hour, maybe 90 minutes, and then he'd close the ledger and sit very still for a while, looking at nothing, and then he'd go to bed. I found that routine oddly comforting. I had not had a routine since leaving home, and watching someone else have one felt like standing near a fire from a safe distance. The snow started around 4 in the afternoon. By 6 it was serious. By 8 it was the kind of snow that makes you understand, in a cellular way, why the old ones built their dwellings into rock. The wind came in off the high mesa like something with a grudge, and the cabin shuddered in a way that cabins are not supposed to shudder, and I lay in the hayloft listening to Tuesday stamp and blow in her stall below me, and I thought, this is the night something goes wrong. I am not psychic. I want to be clear about that. I have no gifts. But I had been sleeping in that hayloft for 6 weeks, and I had learned the particular vocabulary of that land, its sounds, its rhythms, the way the temperature dropped in the hour before dawn, and something in the way the storm moved felt wrong. Not just dangerous, purposeful, like it was looking for someone. I fell asleep anyway. I was 17 and exhausted, and the dog blanket was warm enough. What woke me was the silence. The wind had stopped. Abruptly, completely, the way wind sometimes does in the middle of a big storm, a held breath before the next assault. And in that silence I heard the cabin door. Not a knock. Knocking was not what happened. It was more like a weight against the door, a slow, sustained pressure, the kind a person makes when they are leaning against something because standing has become too much. I heard the latch lift, heard the door drag open across the uneven floor, heard the sound of someone coming in out of the cold. And then I heard Elias' voice, very quiet, very level. "Stop right there." I went to the hayloft's edge and looked down through the gap in the boards. Elias was standing beside the table with the lantern in his hand, not raised like a weapon, just held, like he'd grabbed it on instinct and hadn't decided yet what to do with it. He was in his long underwear and his boots, which meant he'd been asleep and heard her before I did. She was standing just inside the door, which she'd pulled shut behind her. She was Apache. I knew that immediately, though I could not have told you then exactly how I knew. Something about the way she stood. Something about the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, the pattern of it, the specific earth tone colors. She was tall for a woman and thin in the wrong way, the way that means deprivation rather than build. Her hair was loose and wet with snow, and she was holding her left arm against her body with her right hand, and the way she held it told me the arm was either broken or close to it. She looked at Elias and Elias looked at her, and neither of them spoke for what felt like a very long time. Then she said something in Apache. Her voice was lower than I expected. Steady. She was in pain, I could see that, could see it in the set of her jaw, the slight forward lean of her whole body, but her voice was steady. Elia said, "I don't speak that." She switched without hesitation. Her English was careful, each word placed deliberately like stones across a creek. She said, "I am not here to take anything. I need to be out of the cold. I will leave when the storm passes." Elias didn't move. He stood there with the lantern, and I could see his face in its light, that particular expression he had when he was working something out, the same look he got over the accounts on Thursday evenings. Measuring, cautious, not cruel. He said, "What happened to your arm?" She said, "I fell." He said, "Fell how?" She didn't answer that. She just looked at him, and something in that look, the directness of it, the refusal to apologize for not answering, seemed to settle something for him. He set the lantern on the table. He pulled out the chair. He said, "Sit down." She crossed the room and sat down. Her face, as she passed through the lantern light, was extraordinary, not in the way of prettiness, though she was that too, but in the way of someone who has made a decision, and the decision is written everywhere on them. Whatever she decided before she opened that door, she decided it completely. Elias went to the stove and stoked it. He didn't say anything else for a while. I should have gone back to sleep. I know that. I was 17, and it was the middle of the night, and I had no business watching two adults navigate something I didn't understand. But I had a habit, I still do, honestly, though now I write things down instead of just watching them, of needing to see how things turned out. My mother used to call it my rooster problem, meaning I was always craning my neck to see over things. She didn't mean it as a compliment. So I lay on my stomach at the edge of the hayloft and watched. Elias made something, coffee, or what passed for coffee out there, more chicory than anything else, and set it in front of her. Then he went into the back where he slept and came out with a strip of cloth and a piece of flat board, and he set those on the table too, and he looked at her arm and he said, "I'm going to need to touch it." She said, "I know." He sat across from her, and she put her arm on the table between them, and I watched him examine it the way he examined Tuesday when the mare was off, careful, systematic, his big hands moving slowly. He wasn't gentle exactly, but he was precise, and precision in that context was its own kind of gentleness. She made one sound, a sharp exhale through the nose when he reached a particular point on her forearm, then nothing. Her face went somewhere else, not blank, but removed, internal, like she'd found a room inside herself and closed the door. Elias splinted the arm without speaking. He wrapped the cloth around the board and around her forearm and tied it off with 2 knots. Then he sat back and picked up his own coffee and looked at the table. After a while he said, "My name's Elias Cutter. This is my land." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Naini." He tried to repeat it. He got it wrong. She said it again patiently. He tried again, closer. She said, "It means something like speaks plainly. It was given to me when I was young because I used to tell adults when they were lying." Elias made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. "Did that go well for you?" "No," she said, "never once." That was the first time I saw her almost smile. The storm came back around midnight, the second wave worse than the first, and the 3 of us, though she didn't know about me yet, settled into an uneasy kind of coexistence within the small geography of that cabin. She slept in the chair. I could tell she didn't mean to. I could tell she was fighting it. But the warmth of the stove and the release of whatever had been keeping her upright through the cold finally overwhelmed her, and her head dropped and her breathing changed, and she slept. Elias sat at the table across from her for a while, watching the door, watching her, watching nothing. Then he went to the shelf where he kept his books. There were 4 of them, which I had always found quietly remarkable, and took one down and read, or appeared to read. He turned pages with his thumb the way a man does when he's reading, but his eyes moved wrong, too still, too frequently lifted. He was keeping watch. I don't know why that undid me a little. It shouldn't have. He was a practical man, and she was a stranger in his cabin, and it made simple sense to stay awake. But there was something in the way he did it, unhurried, without resentment, settling into the vigilance like it was just the night's work, that felt significant to me in a way I couldn't name at 17 and can barely name now. He was just a man sitting up while someone slept. But I had grown up in a house where no one sat up for anyone, where the doors stayed locked and the lanterns went out early, and whatever you were afraid of it alone. So that's why it undid me a little. She woke before dawn. I know because I was still watching, I hadn't slept again, couldn't, and I saw the exact moment her eyes opened. No transition, no confusion. She was asleep and then she was completely awake, which is something you see in people who have learned that the space between sleeping and waking is dangerous. She looked at Elias. He looked up from his book. She said, "You stayed up." He said, "Storm's still going." She said, "That's not why." He didn't argue with that. He closed the book and set it down and said, "There's more coffee." She stood, moving carefully, favoring the splinted arm. She went to the stove and poured the coffee herself, didn't wait to be served, and stood there with the cup and looked at the window, which was white with packed snow. Then she said, without turning around, "There are men looking for me." Elias said, "What kind of men?" She said, "The kind who get paid to find people like me and bring them back." A pause long enough to matter. Elias said, "Were they taking you?" She turned then, and in the early gray light coming through the snow-thick window, she looked at him with that complete, calibrated steadiness, and she said the name of the place. "I won't write it down here. It's enough to say it was a place people did not come back from the same. A place the government had decided was a solution." Elias put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. He said, "How far ahead of them are you?" She said, "I don't know. Yesterday I thought a full day. Now." She looked at the white window. "The storm will have slowed them too." He said, "Yeah." He picked up his coffee. He stared at it. He said, "The hayloft's warmer than it looks." She went still. Then she said, "There is someone in the hayloft." He looked up at the ceiling, at the boards directly above him, and I pressed myself flat, heart slamming. He said very casually, as though they were discussing the weather, "His name's Boy. He's 17. His father's a drunk and he needed somewhere to sleep, so I let him have the hayloft. He won't cause trouble." A pause. She said, "You didn't tell him I was here." He said, "He already knows. He's been awake up there the whole time." Another pause, then from directly beneath me her voice tilted upward, quiet and precise. "Boy, if that is your name." "Come down." I'd like to say I descended with some dignity. I did not. I came down the ladder in my socks with hay in my hair, and I stood at the bottom of it in the lantern and dawn light and looked at her, and she looked at me, and then she looked at Elias. She said, "He has your same eyes." Elias said, "He does not." She said, "The way they move, watching everything, not missing anything." She looked back at me. "What is your real name?" I told her. She said mine back to me, the actual name, the whole name, not Boy. And the way she said it, deliberate and complete, like a name was something worth saying correctly, hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. She said, "I am Naini. I will not be here long, but while I am, I will not lie to you, and I ask the same." I said, "Okay." She looked at me for another moment. Then she turned back to the window and the whiteness of the storm and what was coming behind it. And whatever the next days were going to be, whatever decisions were going to be made in that cabin while the snow piled against the door and the men with their government papers moved through the cold, they were going to be made by all three of us. I understood that. I was 17 and I understood it completely. I just didn't understand yet what it was going to cost. That's a different thing entirely, and the distance between them matters. The storm held another full day. Elias went out twice, once to check on Tuesday, once to clear the snow piling against the door, and both times he came back inside with the same expression. A kind of careful blankness that I recognized as the face a man makes when he's decided something and doesn't want to be talked out of it yet. He didn't say what he'd decided. He just moved around the small cabin, making food, feeding the stove, doing the ordinary mechanical work of staying alive in the cold. And Naini sat at the table or stood at the window and watched the land. She watched the land the way Tuesday watched the barn door when something was wrong. Not anxious, alert, tuned. I watched her watch it. "You're doing it again," she said on the second afternoon without turning around. I said, "What?" "Studying me." I felt heat crawl up my neck. I said, "Sorry." She said, "Don't apologize. It's the same thing I'm doing to the land. Everyone watches what they need to understand." She paused. "What don't you understand?" I thought about it. I had the rooster problem, but I also had the problem of being 17 and not always knowing the shape of my own confusion. Finally, I said, "You're not afraid. I can't figure out why you're not afraid." She turned from the window then. She looked at me for a moment, and something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, but opening slightly, like a door moved by wind rather than intention. She said, "Sit down. I'll tell you something true." I sat at the table. Elias, across the room, didn't move toward us, but he went quieter somehow. I felt him listening the way you feel a change in air pressure. She sat down across from me, the splinted arm resting on the table between us. The splint made her whole posture slightly asymmetrical, slightly tilted, and she'd adapted to it already in the unconscious way bodies do, the spine compensating, the good shoulder carrying more. She looked at her arm for a moment and then looked at me. She said, "I was afraid once. I want to be clear about that. I was afraid for a long time. When the soldiers came to the valley where I grew up. When my mother died in the second winter after the relocation attempt. When they took my brother east to one of their schools and I did not hear from him for 3 years. She said all of this without particular emphasis, which made it heavier. I was afraid the whole time. I said, "What changed?" She said, "I got tired of waiting for the fear to go away. I decided to learn from it instead." She tapped the splinted arm lightly with one finger. "When I ran, I already knew I might not make it. I ran anyway because the alternative was certain. You understand the difference? Maybe, likely not. These are things you learn only when the choice becomes that simple." She looked at me steadily. "Fear is information. It tells you what matters. Once you know what matters, you stop being afraid of the fear itself. It becomes," she searched for a word, "useful." I said, "What matters to you?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Getting past this winter, reaching my cousin near the northern river, sending word to the people who are still inside the wire that there are still people outside it who remember their names." It was such a plain list, such a specific, human, unromanticized list. I had expected something, I don't know. I was 17 and I'd read the 4 books in Elias' collection and I'd expected something more like a speech. Instead, I got a list of 3 things, all of them practical, all of them quietly enormous. I said, "What's your cousin's name?" She told me. I won't write it here either, not because it doesn't matter. It matters more than almost anything I know, but because some names belong to people, not to stories. Elias made food in the evenings. He cooked the way he did everything, efficiently, without commentary, producing something edible from very little. Dried beef, cornmeal, whatever she had been able to add from a small bundle she'd kept under her blanket through the cold. She'd brought dried berries and something wrapped in cloth that turned out to be strips of dried venison. She put them on the table without ceremony, and Elias incorporated them into whatever he was making without ceremony. And they ate together in the lamplight, the 3 of us, with the storm pressing at the walls. The second night she told us, or rather told the middle space between us, not quite to either of us, why she'd been alone. She'd left the encampment with 2 others. Her sister's husband, a man she referred to as reliable in the careful way she had that told you reliable was the highest compliment in her vocabulary. And a young woman, 17 or 18, who had grown up in the same cluster of families. The bounty hunters had found them on the second day. The reliable man had run east to draw them away. The young woman had twisted her ankle badly in the dark on the first night, and by the second morning was moving so slowly that Naini had made a decision. She stopped talking for a moment here, her jaw set in the particular way that comes before deciding to say something difficult. She said, "I told her to stay. I told her to make a fire be visible, let them find her. I told her they would bring her back to the encampment, not harm her. They were paid for return, not for—" She stopped, started again. "I don't know if I was right." The room was very quiet. Elias said, "What was her name?" Naini looked at him. He said, "What was her name, the girl you left?" A long pause. "Dolly," she said. He said, "You gave her the only choice that had any chance." She said, "I know that." He said, "But..." She said, "But I was the one who decided what chance she'd get." Nobody said anything after that for a while. There wasn't anything to say. Some weight doesn't lift, it just gets named, and naming it is all you can do. On the 3rd morning, the storm broke. I woke to silence and a bar of hard winter light coming through the gap between the hayloft boards. The kind of light that follows a big storm, too bright, almost aggressive, the world scrubbed clean and pitiless. I lay very still and listened. The cabin below was quiet but occupied quiet, not empty quiet. Breathing, stove sounds, the shift and stamp of Tuesday in her stall. Then I heard Elia's very low, very controlled, "How many?" And her voice, two that I know, possibly a third. The third hangs back, I am not certain of him. "Armed?" "Yes, the lead one carries a rifle, Winchester, or similar. The second," a pause. "He is the one I'm less certain about. He seemed to have trouble with the cold." A longer silence. I lowered myself over the edge of the hayloft until I could see them both. She was standing at the window, just to the side of it, looking out at an angle. He was at the table, and between his hands was a piece of paper that I recognized after a moment as the water-damaged ledger, open to a blank page. He was drawing something. A rough map of his land, I realized, the mesa, the creek line, the approach from the south. He said, without looking up, "There's a gully runs east about a quarter-mile north of here. In a big storm, it fills with runoff and then it freezes. Right now it'll be ice-covered, but it won't hold a horse. A man on foot might make it across if he picks his way, but horses will break through." She said, "They're mounted." He said, "I know." A pause. She said, "You would do this." It was not quite a question. He said, "I'm going to ride out and meet them on the south path. Talk to them. Tell them I found tracks heading east yesterday before the storm closed back in. Tell them I watched someone cross the creek line heading for the flats." She turned from the window. Her face was, I don't have the right word, not disbelieving, more like she was testing the reality of the thing, pressing on it to see if it held. She said, "They will ask if you've seen an Apache woman." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you will lie to federal agents." He said, "I'll tell them I saw tracks heading east." He looked up. "I did see tracks heading east, a coyote, I believe, but the snow covers detail." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "You understand the risk you're accepting." He said, "I understand the risk you've already accepted." Something passed across her face then, fast, almost before I could catch it. Grief, I thought, not the fresh kind. The old, carried kind that surfaces briefly in moments of unexpected kindness and then goes back under because the surface is the more dangerous place to keep it. She said quietly, "I told you I was not here to take anything." He said, "You're not taking it, I'm giving it." He went back to his map. "There's also this. You'll need to leave before I get back, heading north, cutting around the gully to the east. I'll draw you the route." She sat down across from him and looked at the map. And then, without being asked, without ceremony, she reached across and turned the ledger slightly so she could see it better, and she pointed to a line he'd drawn, and she said, "This ridge. Is there a drop on the north side?" He said, "About 40 feet." She said, "Too exposed?" She indicated another route. "Here." He said, "Longer." She said, "Longer is fine." They worked on the map together for 20 minutes. Her right hand and his left hand both moving across the page, drawing, correcting. And for those 20 minutes they were two people solving a problem and nothing else. Not enemies, not strangers, not representatives of anything larger than themselves. Just two careful, specific people who had both learned to navigate difficult terrain. I watched from the hayloft and I felt something I didn't have a name for, and later, years later, I decided the name for it was witness. I was a witness. That was my function in that room, to see it happen and carry it forward. She didn't wake me to say goodbye. I was asleep, genuinely, finally asleep, when she left. I woke up to hear the door, and by the time I got to the gap in the loft boards, there was nothing to see. Just Elia's pulling on his coat, just Tuesday stamping in her stall. But on the table where the ledger map had been, there was something left behind. A small piece of cloth. The pattern of it was the same as the blanket she'd worn, that specific earth-tone pattern, cut from the blanket's edge with a knife, a deliberate piece chosen. I climbed down and picked it up. I turned it over in my hands. It was roughly 4 inches square. Elias, buckling his coat, saw me holding it. He said, "Put that somewhere safe." I said, "What does it mean?" He looked at the cloth in my hand for a moment. Then he said, "It means she was here, and she chose to leave something." He went out to saddle Tuesday. I folded the cloth very carefully and put it in the inside pocket of my coat, against my chest. I have it still. The cloth is 30 years old now and the colors have faded some, but the pattern is still visible if you look at it in good light, and I take it out sometimes when I need to remember that the most significant things that have ever happened to me happened in a small room, in a storm, between people who had no particular reason to trust each other. And did anyway. I was in the yard when Tuesday crested the South Ridge, moving fast enough that I felt the first cold lift of alarm. Fast meant trouble. And then I saw Elias' posture, easy in the saddle, and I understood that fast didn't mean trouble. It meant he wanted to be back. He unsaddled Tuesday himself, same as always, and I waited. I had learned from 6 weeks in his hayloft that pushing Elias' cutter produced nothing, and patience produced almost everything. He had the particular quality of some quiet men where silence wasn't avoidance, it was processing. He needed time with information before he could hand it to someone else. He came out of the barn and leaned against the fence post and looked south. He said 2 of them, like she said, young the both of them, which I hadn't expected. One of them had a bad cough. I said, "What did you tell them?" He said, "What I planned to tell them, tracks heading east before the storm closed back." A pause. The one with the cough asked me if I'd had anyone staying at the cabin. I said yes, my nephew, and that he'd been there all week. I said, "Nephew?" He said, it was the first word that came to me. I didn't say anything to that. I didn't have anything to say to it. He said, they believed me because I wasn't trying hard enough to be believed. If you try too hard, men like that feel it. I just told them the next piece of land east is Martin Dunn's place, about 8 miles, and that if they were going to cross the flats before dark, they ought to start. He squinted at the distant ridge. They went. I said, that's it. He said, that's it. Something about that, the simplicity of it, the completeness, felt insufficient to me, and I said so badly in the clumsy way of someone who doesn't yet know how to say a thing. It feels like there should be more. It feels like that wasn't enough to matter. Elias looked at me with the particular attention he usually reserved for Tuesday when she was saying something important. He said, she's 1 day further away from them. That's what matters. He pushed off the fence post and walked toward the cabin. I followed him. We went inside, and it was just a cabin again, just the table and the ledger and the stove and the smell of pine resin and boot leather. But it also wasn't. It was the same room that had contained something for 3 days, and the room hadn't forgotten it even if the thing was gone. Elias sat at the table and opened the ledger to his accounts. He picked up his stub of pencil. I sat across from him and watched him work. After a while I said, did you know, before she got here, did you know those places existed, the ones she named? He didn't look up. I'd heard. Did you know what they were like? A longer pause, the pencil moved. I'd heard that too. I said, and you didn't. I stopped. I didn't know how to finish it. What had he done? What had any of them done, the fair men, the reasonable men, the men who weren't cruel? They'd heard and they'd stayed on their 320 acres, and they'd done their accounts, and they'd talked to their horses. He put the pencil down. He looked at the ledger but not at any number in it. He said, you want to ask me why I didn't do something before, why it took a woman showing up half frozen in my cabin. He wasn't angry. He was very level. Go ahead. I said, I'm asking. He said, because it wasn't in front of me. He said it simply, without excuse, just a fact laid on the table. I knew the shape of it the way you know a far-off storm, but it wasn't in front of me. She put it in front of me. A long silence. I said, so what do you do now that it is? He looked at me then, and I saw something in his face that I'd never seen in it before, not in 6 weeks of proximity, not in the Thursday evenings over the accounts. Something that had been decided, but that he hadn't wanted to examine too closely, because examining it would mean doing something about it. He said, I don't know yet, but I'm going to figure it out. He picked up the pencil again. Probably going to start with writing some letters. Got a congressman's address somewhere from when there was a land dispute. Figure a congressman can get a letter to the right people the same as anyone. I said, you think letters will do anything? He said, no. But they'll do more than not writing them. I should tell you about the weeks that followed, because they mattered, and because I was there for them. Elias wrote 7 letters over the course of January. I know because I watched him write them, sitting at the same table under the same lamp, the same posture as the accounts on Thursday nights, except different, less mechanical, more deliberate. He wrote slowly, which I'd learned was what Elias Cutter did when he cared about precision. He read each one back to himself before folding it. He let me read 2 of them. They were not eloquent letters. They were not grand or sweeping or morally thundering. They said in plain frontier language what he had seen and heard, what he knew from one source about conditions in one place. And they asked whether the person receiving the letter had the authority to inquire further, and if so, whether they would. That was all. I said they're kind of short. He said long letters get skimmed, short letters get read. I said, where'd you learn that? He said, nowhere, I just know how I read letters. He sent them out with the mail rider who came through in late January, and I never learned specifically what became of any of them. I'd like to tell you they changed policy. I'd like to tell you they reached someone who reached someone else and things shifted. I don't know that they did. I only know they were sent. What I can tell you is what Ilias changed. In February, he took on 2 hired hands, something he'd said for years he couldn't afford, and I realized, watching him negotiate their pay, that he'd found money somewhere. I didn't ask where. I had a sense that if I asked, he'd say he'd moved some things around, and that would be the end of the explanation, and I'd have to be content with knowing that 320 acres of high mesa scrub in the territory in 1887 could produce, if you were willing, more resources than a man who talked to horses and did his accounts alone on Thursday nights had previously thought necessary. He hired one of the hands specifically because the man spoke Apache. I noticed this, I didn't comment on it. In March, a man came to the cabin who I learned later was a correspondent for a paper out of Santa Fe. He and Ilias sat at the table for 2 hours, and I was in the barn with the hired hands, and I could hear the low rhythm of their conversation through the wall but not the words. When the man left, Ilias came into the barn and leaned on Tuesday's stall and watched me clean a bridle for a while. Then he said, "You're staying through spring." I said, "AMI." He said, "Unless you've got somewhere better to be." I didn't say anything. The bridle was clean, but I kept cleaning it. He said, "You read well. I've seen you at the books. There might be work that wants someone who reads well." I put the bridle down. I said, "What kind of work?" He said, "The kind where you write down what you see. The correspondent, the man who was here, he said sometimes people need someone local, someone who knows the land and stays put and writes down what they observe." He paused. I told him I knew someone with a rooster problem. I looked at him. He said, "I meant it as a compliment, the way your mother apparently didn't." I have no idea how he knew about the rooster problem. I don't remember ever telling him, but there it was. I want to tell you about the last thing she told us. Before she left, before the morning she slipped out while I slept, she and Ilias had talked for a long time by the stove. I wasn't asleep yet, not quite, and I heard most of it. I have gone back over those words many times in 30 years, turning them the way you turn an object to find the light in it. She told him about the valley she grew up in. Specific things, the way the creek sounded in early summer, the particular color the mesa turned in late afternoon, a type of plant that grew near water and smelled, when bruised, like something she didn't have an English word for. She told him with the quiet, precise attention of someone who is holding something in language because the physical thing may no longer be accessible to them. She was making a record, not for him exactly, through him. She said, "I am telling you these things because if I do not tell them to someone who is still able to move freely in the world, they are only in me. And I may not," she stopped. "I am telling you in case." He said, "In case." She said, "In case the northern river is further than I know." The stove ticked. The wind had gone gentle outside, the storm fully over. He said, "I'll remember them." She said, "I know," a pause. "That is why I'm telling you." And then she told him more, not just the geography of a valley, but the names of people still living inside the encampment she'd left, names and what they were to her, relationships drawn in words across the firelit space of a one-room cabin in the Arizona territory. An old woman who had been a healer. 2 children whose parents had died in the relocation. A man with a specific skill in working leather who was teaching it to whoever would learn so the knowledge wouldn't be lost. She gave Ilias their names, all of them. He repeated each one back, slowly, carefully, the same way he'd tried her name on that first night, getting it wrong, getting it corrected, trying again. And she was patient with every attempt, the same patience I'd seen when she'd told me the fear had become useful. The patience of someone who has decided that a thing matters enough to take the time with. By the end, he had them right, every name. He said, "I'll write them down." She said, yes, a pause. Don't put them in your ledger. He almost smiled. He said, no, somewhere else. I think about Naini whenever someone talks to me about the frontier in the language of legend. The great open, the conquest of it, the romance of solitude and hard work and men who built something from nothing. I think you are not wrong that things were built. You are only wrong about what was demolished to build them and who did the demolishing and what it cost. She was not a symbol. She was a specific person who knew the sound of a creek in early summer and had left a girl named Dolly behind in the snow because there was no good choice, only a slightly better one, and who had sat at a stranger's table and told him the names of people worth remembering. She was afraid and she was tired and she was still moving. That is the whole of her as much as I can give you. That is what I saw. Elias Cutter lived on that land until 1901. He never married. He did write more letters. He spoke with more correspondents, more officials, more anyone who would sit at that table and listen. And he got the rooster problem boy, me, to write down what he knew and what he'd heard, and some of it was printed and most of it wasn't, but some of it was. He died in February, quietly in his sleep, which seemed right for him. I was there by then. I'd never really left, had done my correspondence work from that land for years, and I buried him on the south slope with a view of the mesa. I put the ledger with him, not the account's ledger, the other one, the one he'd started the night she left, 3 days after she arrived, where he'd written down in his slow and careful hand every name she'd given him. I have my own record. I've kept it longer than I've kept most things. I don't know if she reached the northern river. I want to say she did. Every time I think about it, I want to say she did, want it so strongly that I have to be careful, have to check myself, because wanting a thing to be true is not the same as knowing it. What I know is that she was moving when I last saw her. What I know is that she had a root and food and one good arm and the specific, terrible kind of courage that isn't dramatic, that doesn't announce itself or stand tall or make speeches. But that just keeps moving anyway, keeps putting one foot in front of the other in the direction of something worth reaching. She told Elias one more thing before she slept on that last night. I almost missed it. My eyes were closing. The warmth of the stove finally doing its work on 17 years of being too watchful, but I caught it. She said, the people who make the worst decisions are the ones who stop asking whether they're right. They decide they're right, and then they stop asking. A long pause, the fire settling. She said, I try to keep asking. I have tried to keep asking, too. I am not certain I have always succeeded. But I keep the cloth in my inside pocket, and the colors are still there in good light. And when I take it out, I remember a woman who sat at a stranger's table and gave away names like they were the most valuable currency she had. Which they were.